to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live. We are in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We are in Widener Library at Harvard University, which is where all the tourists come when they come to Harvard Yard and take a picture of the library. There's always people. Even today, there was somebody, it's raining, it's been raining all morning, and somebody was sitting on the stairs for a photo in front of the library. So it's just part of what we do, or what happens at Harvard. It's not why we're in Widener to talk about Widener, but we're here because that is where the Harvard Office for Scholarly Communication is, and we're lucky enough to be talking to the director of that office, Peter Suber. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
So this is really fun for us because part of what the website is about is essentially an open access kind of model that we're online and providing scholarship for free, and you've written extensively about open access.
Yep.
You're part of the Harvard Open Access Project,
Yep.
and that's really what the Office of Scholarly Communication is. So if you could just sort of sum up, I know we talked about it just before we recorded, but the Office for Scholarly Communication, what is your role?
I direct the Office for Scholarly Communication, and the office has the job of implementing Harvard's open access policies. Every school at Harvard now has an open access policy. It took a while. These were adopted school by school in separate votes between 2008 and 2014. But in each policy, the faculty grant Harvard permission to distribute copies of their future articles, and they commit to deposit those articles in our open access repository. So when Harvard gets copies, Harvard has permission to distribute them. All we have to do is get our hands on the copies.
Right.
So we implement those policies, and we try to provide open access or free online access to as much of Harvard's research output as we can.
And is that going to be limited to people within the institution? Or if I, just as a member of the public, go to the Harvard Library website, search in Hollis, would I have access to that as well?
Yes, the point of open access is that it's for everybody with an internet connection. It's not just for Harvard people.
Right.
And you wouldn't have to go through Hollis. You could find it in Google Scholar, any other search engine, whether it's academic or non-academic. We try to be indexed and discoverable through as many possible indexes and search engines as possible.
Now, you said that this happened school by school,
Yeah.
and the one thing, I've only been here for 6 or 7 months, whatever it's been, the one thing I've really noticed is that this is a very decentralized
Yes.
place, and each school likes to do its own thing.
That's right.
I'm just wondering, was that a challenge to get everyone on board? And
That was a big challenge.
Yeah.
At more unified universities, there can be a single vote that covers all faculty. That never happens at Harvard on any subject, and, including this one. So every school had to consider the policy separately, debate it separately, and then vote separately. So we had policy first at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in 2008. That didn't bind any faculty at any other school at Harvard. The law school was second, just a few months later. The medical school was last in 2014. But in each case, we had to make a separate campaign. It was more or less like persuading 9 different universities to adopt an open access policy.
Did it help, once one faculty got on board, was it a snowball effect, or was each one a separate case and trying to argue different things? Because obviously publishing in each discipline is different, and there are different models.
Yep.
So was it a similar campaign with each school, or did you have to adapt and say, here's why it's beneficial to you?
Yeah. The policy language was the same. The benefits to faculty were the same. And it probably did break the ice at the schools after the first or second to realize that other Harvard schools had already decided to do this. But Harvard is fragmented for reasons. That is, faculty are proud to do things their own way or to rethink everything from the bottom up. So we had to start over again at every school and explain why the policy was a good idea, why we use this language rather than some other language, and all the consequences for them. And we got pretty much the same questions, objections, and misunderstandings at every school. And by the way, I work with other schools to adopt policies as well, and we get the same questions, objections, and misunderstandings there too. So there's pretty much the same set of obstacles to work through before you get to understanding and support. But we had to do that at each school here.
I guess before we move on, we'll say that open access, the way you define it, is free online scholarship. Is that fair, or is it more nuanced than that?
When I need a short definition, I call it, I say free, open access literature is digital, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. So, first of all, it's online, and you don't pay anything for it. But it should also be under an open license, so it's free for use and reuse as well.
Okay, so the reproduction is very important, because this is one thing that I'm always concerned about with courses is, you put together a course pack and copyright stuff, and it just increases the cost to the students, which I'm not always crazy about.
Right.
So that's an important factor here as well.
That's right. And there is open access to courseware and to handouts and lectures. It's not just for scholarly articles and scholarly books and scholarly data sets. Any kind of content can be digital, and any kind of digital content can be open access. The open access movement focused on scholarship. In particular, it focused on scholarly articles for a good reason. The authors of scholarly articles have never been paid for them. Since the birth of scientific journals in the 17th century, authors donated their articles to the journal because they wrote for impact and not for money. So this was the low-hanging fruit. Unlike books, where authors could receive royalties in principle, even if they don't receive them in practice, articles never paid royalties. So authors were giving them away from the start. There was a more than 300-year tradition in the West of scholars writing these things with great care, but then giving them away without expecting any payment and hoping for wide readership and impact. And the Internet allowed them to have an even wider readership and even greater impact. And, of course, we couldn't pay them, but they weren't expecting to be paid. There was this tradition. So that was the low-hanging fruit. And we're still working on it. That is, it's low enough to be attainable, but not quite low enough to be frictionless. So we still have to persuade people that this is worth doing. On the whole, we've been succeeding very well. The trajectory is definitely up. But it's easier for articles than it is for books. It's easier for articles in some cases than it is for data, even though data were never published. And the same goes for other categories, including courseware and educational handouts. But when the original creators create it for impact and not for money, and when they do it for public benefit, then they see the point of giving it away. They've been giving it away. If only they could get readership or impact in exchange for giving it away. They see the bargain and they're willing to do it. They just need, call it the infrastructure to do it. In one sense, we had that infrastructure as soon as we had the Internet. But it helps to have more refined infrastructure, repositories that can hold this stuff, that make it easy to upload the stuff, that will preserve the stuff, that will make sure it's indexed by search engines. But we have that already too. So now we just have to persuade more and more people to deposit their work, to make it accessible, and to persuade more users that it exists and to use it when it's available. For example, you used the example of courseware or open educational resources. Many educators are writing good open textbooks, open handouts, open video lectures. We have to persuade more schools to make use of them. Schools are doing that, and states that require public approval of works that are adopted in the curriculum are approving these things. But it's a gradual process. So we have to persuade people at the author end and people at the reader end. But we're succeeding at that.
Right. I know for me, I'm going abroad in the summer to teach at a university, and I'm teaching a couple of survey courses, and in the contract it says your textbooks have to be open access textbooks.
Good.
That's all you're allowed to use.
That's right.
Because they don't want to burden their students with additional costs, which I thought was kind of a good idea.
It is.
And then I got to thinking, I got to go look at some open access textbooks, because I've never used textbooks as a instructor. I've only used them as a student, and they've always been, I've had to purchase them. So now, going and researching and finding them, and it's interesting that there's so many more available than I would have guessed. And I'm sort of involved in this even tangentially, and I'm not aware of all the stuff that is available. So I'm sure for you that's sort of part of your uphill battle that you're talking about is, if I'm involved in academia and I'm not aware of all of what's available, for someone who has the perception of academics as stodgy and, the ivory tower, how would they know, right? So that's got to be part of what you're pushing against, in addition to getting academics on board.
That's right. First, we have to persuade people that these things exist. Then we have to persuade them that they can be as high in quality as the works that carry the price tag. And of course they can be. They're written by the same kinds of experts. They just are written by experts with a slightly different motivation, who are more interested in helping other people than in royalties. In the case of scholarly articles, this was pretty easy because they were always given away. In the case of textbooks, it was a little harder because a successful textbook can be extremely lucrative for the author.
Right.
And it's hard to persuade, or initially it was hard to persuade people who were likely to write such good textbooks to make them free instead. There are some ways to make money back from open textbooks, but on the whole, you want people who are willing to write for the sake of students and not for the sake of royalties. But now, after quite a bit of time has passed, we have first-rate open textbooks in every discipline. We didn't have that 10 years ago, but we do now.
I guess that would be part of the challenge with faculty. You know, you say articles are pretty easy to convince people to go open access because you don't get paid for them. But with a textbook, like you say, that you can make a lot of money if you have a successful textbook that's used widely. So how does that conversation go with people who write textbooks and who have made money off of them? Does it go along the lines of, you know, if you're a faculty member, this is sort of part of your publishing mandate, I'm just wondering, like, if I'm used to getting paid and making a bunch of extra money on top of what I get paid from university for a textbook, I would imagine a difficult process to get those people to go open access.
Right. And I don't work too much with open textbooks, but I imagine that the conversation would be very hard with an author who already has a successful selling textbook that brings in a serious revenue stream. Instead, you would go to people in the same field to write alternative textbooks that are just as good but are free of charge. That is, it's hard to ask people to give up their revenue streams when they're already getting them. It's not hard to ask academics to give their work away for the sake of impact and for the sake of education and research.
Right, because that's kind of what the whole point is, right, of academics, is to have your stuff distributed widely and have an impact. Because I don't know what the numbers are in the United States, but you read studies of, in the humanities, articles in scholarly journals get read like 4 times or something on average, and those are ones behind a paywall. But
most of them are not cited at all.
Right.
Doesn't mean they're not read at all, but they're not cited at all. We don't know how often they're read, but there's a long tail, and the majority of works are barely read. And it's not because they're bad, it's because they're in micro-specialized subjects, and only a few people care. And by the way, the authors know that going in. The authors themselves specialize, and they might actually make a contribution to knowledge in that small niche. And they're writing for the other 6 people in the world who are in the same small niche. And that's one reason this kind of research, which actually accomplishes something, has to take place outside the market. Because if you could only produce that by selling it, there'd never be a market large enough to justify producing it. So it has to be a gift culture. You have to agree in advance. I'm writing for an audience that already is waiting for the 9th decimal place on this piece of knowledge, and there aren't too many of those. There certainly aren't enough to pay the costs of production, so I'm going to just give it away. And the university system has known this for centuries, and so we hire people and we pay them salaries so that they are free to give away the results of their scholarship. If we depended on them to sell it, then essentially nobody would get to the 9th decimal place on a piece of knowledge. After the first or second, they would have used up the market, and knowledge would stop. That is, would not become more fine-grained, more precise, deeper, more extensive. Instead, we would just have broader but not deeper knowledge.
And that's on a majority of things. Like, I always joke that, like, there's a new book about the Civil War every 20 minutes sort of thing. So, like, there's some stuff where there seems to be an endless market, but for 99%, not so much.
That's right.
So the question then of who pays for it, you mentioned that universities pay faculty to do research. Most universities, smaller liberal arts teaching schools are more focused on teaching, but a school like this, research is a main focus. And there's certainly government grants and more private grants in this country than at home, but there's money out there to do that. But publishers make a lot of money off of academic journals.
Yes, they do.
Do you talk to them about getting their authors out of these contracts that prevent them from putting them into repositories like an open access one here? Or are you trying to work with publishers to maybe find a model for them to go open access? Or are you focused mostly on the faculty?
It's a good question because the answer is complicated. First of all, we scholars, including research institutions, want to act in our own interests, not in the interests of publishers. We want the work we read to be free of charge. We want the work we produce to be free of charge so that it can be widely taken up, used, applied, cited. If publishers can stop us, then we want to talk with them so that they do less to stop us. on the whole, the people in the best position to stop us are the unpersuaded fellow scholars. And so a lot of our energy, if we're smart and strategic, I think most of our energy goes to persuading our fellow scholars. If they're not taking advantage of this opportunity, that's actually worse for us than publishers lobbying against it or refusing to cooperate. And from the earliest days, publishers were cooperative to some extent. That is, you could publish in a conventional journal that charged subscriptions so that the result was not open access. But the majority of publishers of that kind gave standing permission to their authors to put the copy of the peer-reviewed article in an open access repository. The majority of such publishers. They didn't have to do that. If they didn't, we would have tried to persuade them to do that. But the persuasion wasn't difficult. And even today, the majority of conventional publishers give this kind of standing permission. So authors can publish there and make a peer-reviewed copy of their article open access through a repository. It has to be the author's initiative. The publisher's not making it open themselves.
Right.
And authors have to be persuaded to understand that the option exists and then to seize the opportunity. That's where it gets back to persuading fellow scholars. But some publishers still don't offer the standing permission. They're a minority, but they exist. And then when effective national or funding agency open access policies are in the offing, many publishers will lobby hard against them. That's another way in which they're hurting us. There's not much we can do to persuade them to stop. That is, we've tried. We've published arguments against their arguments. It's a public debate, and on the whole, the trade associations representing conventional publishers are aggressive and well-funded in lobbying against these policies, even if individual publishers are more indifferent or more accommodating. So there's a sense in which publishers are opposed. There's a sense in which publishers are accommodating. Some publishers are actually experimenting seriously with open access themselves. This is relatively new compared to what things were like 20 years ago. It was such a new idea that, of course, no publishers were experimenting with it. It was too new.
Yeah.
But even after it became a familiar idea, some publishers said, that's not for us. In fact, that would hurt us. We're not going to do it ourselves, but we're not going to stop other people from trying it out. Others said, we're not going to do it ourselves, and we'll do our best to stop other people from trying it out. And we'll do our best to stop funding agencies from requiring it. We'll do our best to prevent universities from requiring it. So publishers have taken a range of attitudes. One thing that I think all of our supporters should understand is that publishers are not monolithic. Some were born open access, some have completely converted to open access, some have partially converted to open access, some have not converted but give standing permission for open access, and then some are seriously experimenting with it because they don't want to be the last publisher without any experience with it as the world changes toward open access. So publishers are in different positions, but insofar as they've been accommodating, allowing us to do or to seize the opportunity, provided we're willing to seize the opportunity, then we don't have to overcome any obstacles. But insofar as they're lobbying against good policies, we do have to fight back. And on the whole, we've been successful there. That is, legislators who adopt open access policies for publicly funded agencies are more persuaded by our arguments than by their arguments. And I think the reason is these are public funding agencies dispersing public money for the public benefit. And the point is to share it with everybody who could benefit from it, not to give it to publishers who will lock it up when it's already paid for by taxpayers.
Been teaching this semester on popular culture, and these private-public partnerships that are done for commercial gain exist. But this is not a case where there's commercial gain for everyone involved in the project. It's really just for the private entity, and the person who's been funded by the public is giving away what the public has paid for to a private outlet.
In the absence of these open access policies, authors would do all the hard work, usually subsidized by public money.
Yeah.
They give it away themselves, so they're not being paid for it. They give it to a publisher who then locks it up and only meters it out to paying customers.
Right.
And so this publicly funded research ends up in private hands. It's a revenue-generating asset for a private corporation. And the fact that public money paid for it in the first place was just lost.
Right.
And so the public isn't getting its money's worth. The author who intended to reach people and expand readership and impact isn't getting what he or she intended. That is, why did they consent to give it away without being paid royalties? For the sake of readership and impact. But when their work is locked up by private companies and only given to paying customers, they're not getting the full benefit of that.
Right.
So authors are losing, the public is losing, taxpayers are losing, and these federal agencies are not serving the public interest that they were intended to serve. That's a pretty compelling case, and it's so compelling that liberal and conservative legislators see it. It's one of the only issues on which there is bipartisan support in the United States today.
Right. And it's interesting because when I tell people about stuff that I've published, they're like, "Oh, how much did you make off that?"
Yeah.
You say, "Well, nothing."
That's right.
Because and it's because it's so different from pretty much any other publishing model.
Exactly. And even if you talk to people who do publish, like novelists, poets, unless they're academic novelists or poets, they've never heard of this. And the idea that you would work hard to write something and then not be paid, and even know that going in, and it's not just that you had bad luck not to be paid, but that you intended to write something without payment, that's brand new to them. And one of the problems we had lobbying Congress to persuade them to adopt these policies is that they thought we were already being paid royalties because that's the only publishing model they'd ever heard of.
Right.
And by the way, publishers didn't disabuse them of that.
Right.
I'm not sure publishers actually lied and said we pay royalties to these authors. But when legislators showed that they misunderstood the system and they thought authors were already being paid, publishers didn't correct them.
Right.
So that was an obstacle. I once was talking with a notable published poet at a party, and he asked what I did, and I explained I work for this, and he was horrified because he depends on the trickle of revenue that comes from published poetry. And even if you're successful, that's a small trickle.
Right.
And I had to make clear, well, I'm not talking about poetry or novels for which there is revenue or royalty. I'm talking about scholarly articles for which there isn't royalty. And he was a former professor of history, and he got it right away. He just misunderstood the scope of this movement. And he said, "Oh, yeah, well, of course, those things ought to be given away for free." I thought you were talking about my stuff.
Right, yeah. It's also like the labor involved, like peer review. I've peer-reviewed stuff. I haven't been paid for that.
That's right.
Either, right? So it's not even just the author.
Right. This is actually one of the beautiful aspects of the opportunity here. Authors, for more than 300 years, have been giving away their articles without expecting to be paid.
Right.
And the people who peer review the articles have been donating their time for the same period, not expecting to be paid. And the editors who supervise the peer review process read the referee reports and decide what revisions to require and whether the paper is finally acceptable, are also donating their labor.
Right.
So everybody involved in the authoring and the peer review process is giving away their work and their labor. And yet, they've all been giving it to publishers who lock it up and sell it to people.
Publishers could get away with that because to live, you were making your money from the university and you were getting paid a wage. It was considered that this was part of the job. But now that we have this tool of the internet to allow for open access, we can completely change the model.
Yeah, I would put it this way. In the age of print, what publishers did when the authors and referees were done was a fairly expensive job, and they needed payment to cover their expenses. When the internet came along, it became, or it could have become, a much less expensive job. So the barrier was much lower, and we could distribute this work without extra charge, and we could find new payment models that would reimburse the small cost that remained. That's roughly what we're doing now.
Right.
But publishers that were large and thriving in the era of print wanted to remain large and thriving. They benefited from this tradition of giving works to publishers and letting them sell it, and in fact granting them all rights to the work in the publishing contract. And there was inertia for that, so I'm going to call this a custom rather than anything stronger. It's a custom we can change. It was never a law. It's not absolutely required for economic sustainability. It's just the way things worked in the age of print. How much changed when the internet came along? Well, we, working for open access, thought this was one of those things that changed. Publishers didn't. Publishers said, well, we still have expenses, which is true.
Yeah.
But it's not true that we have to work with them. We can work with other publishers that don't have the same level of expenses. We can work with lean and mean startups who don't have legacy overhead from the age of print. We can work with different business models or payment models that do cover the costs of the publisher, but without charging the reader and letting that charge function as an access barrier. So we had lots of options, and traditional conventional publishers had one model that they kept pursuing because it was lucrative for them, or because the alternative was brand new and they hadn't finished thinking it through.
Now, you mentioned you can go with sort of new startups, different people. I think this is one of the challenges that grad students and early career academics are finding. I would say mostly grad students, and I say that only because I'm more conversant with grad students, having more recently been a grad student, that we're expected, if we want to go in the job market, to publish in big name journals, right? And so these are a lot of them from these legacy, long-standing, at least 50 volumes, like these sorts of things, like journals that people have heard of.
Yep.
So for graduate students, is it more difficult for them to go to a new journal, a purely open access, just because of the reputation issues and the state of the job market, and having to go with older, more established journals? Is it a challenge to the open access model?
Yes, if you mean, do we face some resistance from junior faculty who have to put their career first? We do get those sorts of objections. There are good answers to those objections. And I should also add there's another side to this. The scholars who most support the idea of open access are younger faculty,
right.
The ones who grew up with the internet,
right.
The ones who expect almost everything that they want to read to be available, not only online, but to be available online free of charge.
Yes.
So they expect that for the works they're looking for, and they aren't surprised when people expect it for their own work. They see why that would benefit everybody if only we could get there. But they feel this pinch. They want to be hired, so they have to please the hiring committee, or they're already hired, they have to please their promotion and tenure committee. What it takes to please them is to publish in prestigious journals. Prestigious journals have to be old to have acquired the right level of prestige. If they're old, they're probably not open access.
Right.
Even if open access journals are equal in quality, they're not equal in venerability and prestige for the sake of these committees.
Yes.
So my advice to those junior faculty, young scholars, is publish where you have to publish to get your career, because we want you to have a career, we want you to succeed. But don't forget, you can publish in those journals, and much more often than not, you can put a copy of the peer-reviewed article in an open access repository without violating copyright, because the publisher lets you. It's in the contract.
Right.
Look for it. You probably have that opportunity, and it's then up to you to seize it. So if you're truly a supporter of open access, but just feel constrained not to take advantage of it, don't feel so constrained. You can publish in those journals and still make a copy of the peer-reviewed manuscript open access. Again, this option is not widely understood, even though it's been there for more than a decade at most journals. But then there's a growing number of open access journals that are not only high in quality, but also high in prestige, because they've been around long enough to acquire that. That's new and wonderful. That is, a journal that's excellent from birth cannot be prestigious from birth, because prestige is a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
But they can be prestigious after a few years. And we have journals that are plenty old now, old enough to be prestigious and high in quality. And prestige actually means to be known to be high in quality,
yes.
or to have a reputation for being high in quality. So many junior faculty today can publish in those prestigious open access journals and also please their promotion and tenure committees.
Right. I guess, and then the flip side of this is that the people who have the most leverage for open access would be the senior faculty.
Right.
You know, the people that schools like Harvard can go, who are already, you know, full professors somewhere else, and Harvard can say, hey, come to our school, and people come. I've been going to these new faculty lunches over at the Humanities Center, and you think of new faculty as junior, but a lot of these people are very senior faculty who Harvard has been able to recruit. And these are the people who would have leverage in dealing with publishers, and who I would assume you would want to be on the forefront of this battle, because they're the types of authors who people know and who people want to read. And so if they're really pushing for open access, those are the sorts of people who would really have a lot of clout, where someone like me could say open access, great, but nobody knows who I am.
That's right. Senior faculty are generally less familiar with open access than junior faculty, but some of them are quite familiar and very supportive. And when they have the eminence that comes from being senior in their field, they can do a lot to help a new open access journal by submitting work to it. Suddenly, it went from being high in quality but unknown, and therefore without prestige, to being high in quality and well-known or prestigious. And if the work is widely cited, or let's say widely paraphrased in the media or in other articles, all the citations point back to this journal, which was hitherto not well known, and it becomes well known. So one way that new journals try to acquire the reputation they need to attract good submissions is to have good submissions. It's a vicious circle. They need good submissions to have prestige. They need prestige to attract good submissions. But senior scholars can help break the vicious circle by submitting good work to journals that are good enough to deserve their support, but not yet very well known. And it suddenly helps them become well known. They can also help by serving on the editorial boards for those journals.
Right.
Yep.
And that really helps to say, hey, you know, this person is one of our editors, and everyone's, oh, okay, like, all right.
That's
like,
right.
Like the legitimacy that comes from being a senior faculty can be transferred to the journal simply by your presence.
That's right.
And a legitimacy that, again, a junior faculty, someone like me, like I think I do good stuff. But, I mean, I don't have that reputation because I'm a junior individual.
Right. And senior faculty understand this. They understand that journals live off prestige, even when prestige is not the same thing as quality. But they also know that they have prestige to lend.
Right.
And they can lend it by submitting an article or by serving on an editorial board or just by talking about it in public and not making it sound like it's only for junior faculty, only for second-rate faculty, only for cutting-edge nerds. If they say in public, I wrote this to be read. I wrote because I want to influence therapy for this disease, or I want to develop a more efficient solar panel. I did it for the sake of something concrete in the world, and I need it to be read by as many people as possible. I need it to be applied and not just published. Then they educate people about the real benefits. Without that, I think there's a risk that people think of open access as just cool and not useful.
Right.
And it's actually useful. That's the whole point.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess the one thing you say, people want the stuff to be read. Now, one of the issues that a lot of people have with academics and academic writing is that when you go to read it, it's not very accessible in terms of the language used, this sort of stuff. And we actually had this discussion over lunch the other day, and I was telling a story that when I was doing my comps, I had a professor say to me, "What'd you think of this article?" And I said, "Well, I mean, the argument's okay, but just the writing is so bad." And he said, "Well, style doesn't matter." And I thought, well, that's a weird thing to say, because of course style matters. And we want these things to be read widely. Is part of open access then also trying to get people to change writing styles and to write more accessibly and not dumb it down, because I hate that term, but like to write with language that is more accessible, to write in a style that is more engaging than what traditionally the reputation of academic journals has been?
Yep. That's also a good question, because the answer is complicated. When I say the purpose of open access is to expand readership to everybody with an internet connection and not to lock out the people whose libraries can't afford subscriptions.
Right.
I mean it. It truly expands readership, and not just to fellow scholars, but to the general public. But I think most authors care most about being read by fellow scholars.
Right.
What they have to appreciate, which they don't always appreciate, is that most of their fellow scholars don't actually have access. They work at schools that don't have the library budgets necessary to subscribe to the journal. So you're writing for the subset of the scholars in your field. Let's call it the lucky subset, who are at wealthy institutions that can afford it. And by the way, we're talking now from the wealthiest institution with the largest academic library in the world. And not even Harvard can afford to subscribe to all these journals. Every year, every single year, it makes journal cancellations for budgetary reasons alone, not because they're not widely used here or because they're not high in quality, but just because we don't have enough money. The problem is worse every place else. So first, most scholars don't appreciate that they're not already reaching all the fellow scholars that they want to reach. And it would be fine if that's all they cared about. Okay, I want to reach all my fellow scholars. The only way to do that is through open access. I don't care at all about the lay public. But once they start to make it open, they become aware that the lay public is either reading it or capable of reading it. And in some fields, there's a larger percentage of lay readers than in others. For example, a lot of non-medical professionals read medical literature about their own medical conditions or about the medical conditions of family members.
Right.
When the National Library of Medicine converted to open access more than a decade ago, its usage, its downloads went up over 100-fold.
Wow.
And today, most of their visitors are from non-EDU domains.
Oh, wow.
So I think people underestimate how many lay readers actually care about cutting-edge research, at least in certain fields.
Right.
But even if, by the way, I completely share your premise that a lot of academic writing is bad. It's needlessly inaccessible, needlessly thick. It's one of these don't get me started issues. There's no reason for it. Even if you're only writing for fellow scholars, you don't have to write that badly.
Right.
On the other hand, once you make your work accessible, even if it's thick, you are reaching more people. And then it might sink in, and for some scholars it is sinking in, that you're also writing for a larger public, and you should take some pains to make your work intelligible to them. There are a couple ways this is happening. Some scholars internalize this themselves and say, I better address the people who aren't exactly scholars in my field. Sometimes, by the way, there are scholars in neighboring fields who are equally specialized, but who see some cross-disciplinary relevance of your work. But sometimes they're just lay, non-professional readers who have some interest in your topic. Another way it's happening is that there's a kind of secondary work that's growing up, which is the open access summary of a scholarly article. The scholarly article itself might be open or non-open, but it's thick, it's hard to read, it's impenetrable, or even if it's very lucid for the few people who are specialists in the field, it's not lucid to anybody outside that field.
Right.
So it might be important enough to paraphrase or to summarize for other people, even if they're specialists in neighboring fields. And there are works now, whole resources devoted to that kind of restatement or paraphrase of scholarly work. That works best when the original works are open access, because the people doing this kind of paraphrasing or summarizing need access themselves. By the way, this gets to a related topic. Call it science journalism. Science journalists need access to cutting-edge articles to summarize breakthroughs. Sometimes they get their knowledge of breakthroughs from attending conferences where they hear it orally reported. But if they want to read the article itself, they tend not to have access. They might get a copy slipped to them by the author. But science journalists need open access to the research that they're reporting on. And it would be better, all in all, better journalism, if they could include a link to an open access copy so that their readers who suddenly got interested through their own article could click through and read the full text.
Sure.
So it helps this paraphrasing industry, it helps journalism, it helps educate the lay public, even those members of the lay public who aren't reading it directly themselves, but are reading it through journalists. Right.
So as part of your efforts, though, that's part of your argument, but it's not saying to people you have to change the way you write. You don't. You're writing for a large audience, or potentially a larger audience, and that's great.
Yeah, I would say you ought to change the way you write, because it's bad. But you don't have to change the way you write simply to make it open.
Right.
Open access is a kind of access. It's not a kind of writing.
Now, would you put MOOCs in this same open access category? I know a friend of mine has done Harvard MOOCs before. And for anyone who doesn't know, MOOCs, just basically large open access free courses from universities. Is that part of this open access movement as well?
Yes, and the word open is in the MOOC acronym. Open courseware was an earlier term. Like MOOCs, except not always massive.
Right.
And nowadays, you might distinguish many threads of the larger openness movement: open access to texts, open data, open educational resources, open courseware, open source or free software, open government, open collaboration, open innovation. There are lots and lots. Or you could see them all as unified under some concept of openness, or you could see them as somehow separate. There hasn't yet been quite the unification here that there was in the 50s and 60s in the environmental movement. Some people point to that as an analogy to what we're seeing on the openness movement. There were movements for for clean air, movements for clean water, movements for animal conservation. But nobody initially thought of these as pieces of a united environmental movement.
Right.
But after a while, they did. And I think now, people working in these separate threads of the openness movement do see them as unified by some concept of openness, some concept of sharing, some concept of removing needless obstacles to sharing, even if there are other obstacles that are not quite so needless. And they're beginning to think more broadly about what we all have in common.
Right.
So the only reason to say MOOCs and OpenCourseWare are not part of the same movement is if it's important to split things that are closely related. Right. It's just as important to see the similarities of things that are slightly different.
I guess the last question I would have is, you alluded to a little bit, is just the financing of this whole thing. And I guess the question that publishers would ask, and their lobbying would be, well, who's paying for this? And I mean, we talked about how with journals, they can reduce the cost. I mean, I know every time I move or end a semester and have to or clean out an office or something, there are always copies of journals that I pitch because I don't want to carry around journals. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's the way to reduce cost is there, but the question still is, who pays for the cost that still is associated with being online? And I would imagine that's the biggest pushback you get, as to who pays for those.
Yep. Back to the earlier question about the different threads of the openness movement. Yeah. One reason they're different is that they don't all use the same funding models, and they can't all use the same funding models.
Right.
There are ways to pay for open journals that you cannot apply to books or courses or data sets, and vice versa. So that will keep them somewhat distinct. But to go to articles, There are many ways to pay for open access articles. In fact, I, with a research assistant, maintain an online open access list of different business models that are already used by different open access journals, precisely to show people that there's more than one.
Right.
There's one that people know well, and they mistakenly think it's the only one, or they mistakenly think it's the dominant one, when it's neither the only one nor the dominant one. It's just the best known. And that's to charge what's called an article processing charge, an APC, or a publication fee. So you can't charge the reader, otherwise it wouldn't be open. But you can charge somebody at the author's end. It is typically the author's employer or the author's funding agency. When research is funded, many funders say, you're allowed to use a piece of this grant to pay the fee at a journal like that. And this is the best known, but as I say, not the most common. Most open access journals charge no such fees at all. It's another one of these well-kept secrets. Most scholars, even scholars who support open access, are not aware of this. About half the articles published in open access journals are published in the fee-based ones, but about 70% of open access journals themselves charge no fees at all. Only 30% charge these fees. How do the no-fee journals get their money? There are many different models there, but they're all variations on the theme of subsidy. They get a subsidy from some institution or some group of institutions to pay their bills. It might be 5 to 10 nonprofits who work in their area who want to see a good peer-reviewed journal exist in that area on that topic. It might be a funding agency itself. It might be a museum. It might be a hospital. It might be a university. Or, as I say, it might be some consortium of these specifically put together to support a journal.
And if a school or like you say, like NGOs or whatever it is, you have a journal that helps you, like an open access journal, like especially if it's a good one and or earns a reputation of being a good one, that helps.
That's right. They have their own interest already. They want to see a high quality peer reviewed journal in their topic area.
Right.
They may be an NGO, not a university. They may not do research, but they need the research done by others, and their research helps them do their job or fulfill their mission. So they want to see such a journal exist. Maybe they can't pay 100% of the costs of a peer-reviewed journal, but they can pay a tenth of the costs. So if you can get 10 institutions to do this, then suddenly they're all on board with it. Right. I once talked with an open access journal about how it could pay for itself, and I proposed this particular model. And the editor said, but what do they get out of it? And I said, well, first of all, they get research. Research that they need to do their own work. And secondly, they get your public thanks. And she said, exactly right. I mean, that ought to suffice for them because they're non-profits. They shouldn't expect revenue back from us or some other kind of good back from them.
And if they're getting all the labor in terms of the editing and the writing for free, like that's great.
That's right.
And then sort of everyone cooperates in this model. And it's weird that, I mean, academics do have, to a certain extent, the reputation of being hoity and locked off from the community in certain respects. But when it comes to publishing, at least with articles, it's all, like you say, we're giving it away for free for hundreds of years.
Scholarly articles are a gift culture. They have been a gift culture. Not just because authors give them away, but because the public has been funding them. And basically the public is supporting people in giving them away.
Right.
And then the authors give them to publishers, and publishers receive them as gifts, and then they turn these gifts into commodities by putting a price tag on them to recover their expenses. Now, again, from the age of print, they had expenses that they needed to recover that particular way. But now their expenses can be recovered other ways. There are at least the 15 ways that I've documented on this online list. They don't need to erect this price barrier to recover their own expenses.
Well, this is terrific. And the Harvard Office for Scholarly Communication, you say that you're the director. So if people go to this site, resources, you mentioned this list of models.
Yeah, it's not on the OSC website.
Okay.
It's on call it an open access encyclopedia of open access.
Okay.
Called the Open Access Directory, or the OAD. The OAD has lots of factual lists about open access. One of them is this list of business models used by different open access journals. Okay. But there are lots of others.
Is that an oad.edu or .org, or if I just Google?
If you Google Open Access Directory.
Okay. And it'll all be there. Terrific.
You'll be there. Yep.
And you also wrote a book entitled Open Access.
That's right.
Through MIT Press, I believe.
Right. Yep.
So folks can check that out as well. It's
and the
online.
Book itself is open access.
Yep. So it's all there. So we encourage everyone to check it out. And we will link to all this stuff, too, when we post this on the website. So, Peter Suber, the director of the Harvard Office for Scholarly Communication, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
If you have any questions, comments for the podcast, it's historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.